Hormuz remains closed to most traffic as
a missile fragment falling to the ground and exploding in Doha.
A number of cargo ships have been attacked in the Strait of Hormuz.
Strait of Hormuz Keshem Outer Defensive Belt 2:17 AM 2000 Marines, 11 target structures, enemy strength unknown, intelligence objective, data archives, encrypted drives, 1 high-value detainee, and a concealed weapons stockpile. The island looked asleep from the water. Low concrete structures crouched behind seawalls and earth berms, their flat roofs silvered by moonlight and sea haze. A scatter of light poles marked the perimeter roads, but most of the compound lived in darkness, broken only by a weak glow near a generator shed and the ember of a cigarette at an outer watch post. Intelligence had painted the site as more than a logistics node. Somewhere inside those buildings were archives, digital storage devices, and a prisoner whose value outweighed the concrete around him. Night was chosen because night did not belong equally to everyone. For the defenders, darkness was cover. For the attackers, darkness was a weapon. The village sat like a clenched fist beside the shoreline, its alleys narrow, its walls high enough to cut a man's vision in half. There were 11 primary structures, 2 internal courtyards, 3 vehicle bays, a communication shack, and a small power station feeding intermittent current to the southern side of the camp. Guard posts overlooked the main approach road and the seawall, while sandbagged firing points watched the causeway linking the island position to a secondary storage area farther inland. Intelligence suggested documents were stored in administrative rooms, encrypted servers were hidden behind false partitions, and the detainee was being moved between interior spaces to prevent pattern recognition. The defenders were believed to have assault rifles, machine guns, rocket-propelled munitions, and enough familiarity with the terrain to turn every alley into a trap, if they had time to see what was happening. At 2:17, the first confirmation came not from the ground but from above. Overhead, silent observation tracked the target pattern. 2 guards rotating late, a third man asleep at his post, movement inside one administrative building, no movement in the vehicle bays. The island below looked static in the darkness, but under amplified green imagery every heat signature mattered. A door cracked open on the northern side and shut again. A figure crossed a courtyard carrying something long and metallic, then vanished into shadow. The raid commanders did not need noise. They needed certainty, and certainty came in fragments measured in seconds. At 2:20, the force moved. No flood of shouting. No warning. Just shape after shape slipping through the dark in disciplined silence, each element cutting toward a different section of the objective area. Through night optics, walls glowed in muted edges, doorframes sharpened, and human bodies burned pale against colder concrete. The defenders saw almost nothing. A breeze off the water stirred dust along the lanes, masking movement where movement needed masking. From the outside, the island remained still. Up close, it was already being taken apart. 3 minutes into the raid, the outer approaches were sealed. Escape routes that had existed at 2:17 no longer existed at 2:20. Vehicles halted where they could dominate roads, blind corners, and open ground, their presence mostly hidden except for brief glints and the low silhouettes of men watching outward. The entire point of the perimeter was denial. No reinforcements in, no fighters out, no warning shot reaching a neighboring post in time to matter. The defenders inside the compound still believed the night belonged to them. That belief was about to become their greatest vulnerability. At 2:22, the first entries happened nearly at once. Doors were forced, corners swallowed, interiors flooded not with light but with speed. The darkness inside the buildings was different from the darkness outside. Thicker, close, full of furniture outlines and hanging cloth and sudden doorways leading to tighter black spaces. Men moved room to room with practiced precision, communicating in taps, gestures, laser marks invisible to the enemy, and clipped whispers too brief to be fear. Everything was immediate. Every shadow might hold a rifle. Every blanket might hide a body or a wire or a lie. 5 minutes into the raid, the first resistance broke in a northern structure that intelligence had assessed as a records building. It was not a records building. It was partly that, but it was also sleeping quarters for armed personnel who woke into a nightmare they could not decode. Some tried to rise from mats and reach for weapons. Some ran to the wrong side of the room, thinking the threat was outside the windows rather than already among them. Some fired blindly, their muzzle flashes only betraying their own positions. The response was sudden and controlled, the kind of violence that lasts seconds but decides the shape of the next 10 minutes. At 2:24, a complication hit from the south side of the compound. The generator, dormant for most of the approach, coughed alive with a metallic shudder and then roared into operation. A line of bare bulbs snapped on across one courtyard and 2 external walls, throwing yellow light over sandbags, barrels, and the side of a communication shack. For a heartbeat, the visual balance changed. The defenders expected illumination to save them. Instead, it exposed them. Every man who had frozen in the dark now had a shape. Every hurried movement across open ground became visible from multiple angles. The light did not rescue the island. It gave it away. At 2:25, the force adapted instantly. Identification markers invisible to the unaided eye kept friendly elements clear to one another while the newly lit areas were cut into sectors and controlled with ruthless speed. The men moving through the open did so under coverage from heavier positions that had been waiting precisely for something like this. One team redirected toward the generator shed, another pinned the courtyard, and within moments the new light became just another environmental fact. Dangerous, yes, but manageable. The defenders had triggered what they thought was a solution. Instead, they had accelerated their own collapse. 7 minutes into the raid, a second complication emerged in the least convenient place possible. An unexpected cluster of enemy fighters in a storage building believed to be empty. What had been mapped as overflow space turned out to be a concealed fallback position, and it sat close enough to the administrative row to threaten the intelligence collection effort. The first sign was movement where there should have been none. The second was a burst of fire from a doorway that had been dismissed as locked dead space. The attack shifted in an instant from rapid domination to a knife fight around a blind corner. At 2:26, the answer came from coordination, not chaos. Containment tightened on the building while adjoining teams froze their advance rather than overextend into intersecting lanes. Pressure was applied from multiple angles, denying the fighters inside any clean route of escape or counterattack. Overwatch fed updates, the perimeter held firm, interior teams kept the intelligence spaces from being abandoned. The defenders had finally understood what was happening, but understanding it at 2:26 was not the same as stopping it. By then, they were reacting to a machine already in motion. At 2:27, inside one of the central structures, the search element hit what looked like the night's prize: metal cabinets, bundled papers, stacked ledgers, external drives, and concealed electronics tucked behind false paneling. The room smelled of hot dust and stale paper. Screens still glowed from hasty use, their light a weak blue against the green world of night optics. Bags came open. Devices disappeared into them. Documents were swept, sorted, prioritized. Nobody in that room cared about the architecture anymore. Concrete was just packaging. The real target was information. 10 minutes into the raid, the detainee was found, but not in the room intelligence had predicted. He was in a secondary space, restrained, disoriented, and positioned in a way that immediately raised suspicion. Nothing about it looked natural. The angle of the chair, the cleared floor around it, the slight asymmetry in the doorframe, the kind of detail invisible to panic but obvious to men trained to distrust convenience. The room paused without truly stopping. In a raid measured by speed, caution suddenly became the faster choice. At 2:28, the possibility of a trap was treated as fact. The space was isolated, the approach adjusted, and the detainee secured only after the area was checked with deliberate care. What looked like a crude insurance policy by the defenders became another failure of timing. They had expected confusion, but what arrived was discipline. The prisoner resisted once, then twice, more from terror than loyalty, before being controlled and moved. Seconds mattered, but so did not dying for a room that wanted to kill the wrong person. At 2:29, the storage building on the eastern side collapsed as a pocket of resistance. Not physically collapsed, operationally. Its defenders had fired, shifted, shouted, and tried to regroup, but the weight against them was too organized, too fast, too certain. Once contained, isolated, and denied movement, they ceased to be a maneuver element and became an obstacle waiting to be cleared. The island was not defending itself anymore. It was breaking apart room by room, yard by yard, wall by wall. 12 minutes into the raid, the communications shack was entered and stripped. Radios, notebooks, frequency charts, and removable media vanished into collection bags. Outside, the shoreline remained black and deceptively peaceful, tide pushing softly against stone as though nothing important was happening 50 meters inland. That contrast was its own kind of cruelty. The night was calm. The camp was not. Men who had gone to sleep inside a defended island position were waking into the realization that their isolation had become a prison. At 2:30, movement was reported near the vehicle bays. Whether it was an attempted breakout or blind panic no longer mattered. The approaches were already denied, and the men who ran into those lanes ran into a geometry designed against them. Dust lifted in brief pale clouds under bootsteps. A shouted warning in one alley died under heavier command from elsewhere. The defenders were starting to understand the worst part of being surprised at night. Not just that the enemy is present, but that he sees more, understands more, and decides faster than you do. At 2:31, the intelligence teams finished their highest priority sweep. Hard drives, paper ledgers, identity documents, maps with handwritten annotations. Device after device unplugged and packaged in darkness, lit only by residual screen glow and dim filtered lamps. The value of a raid like this was never measured solely in bodies or buildings. It was measured in what followed: networks exposed, movement patterns reconstructed, shell companies identified, hidden routes mapped, future operations born from the wreckage of one. 14 minutes into the raid, the island's defenders tried one last narrative of control. Sporadic fire erupted from separated points almost at once, a desperate effort to create the illusion of a coordinated counterattack. But isolated muzzle flashes do not become a defense simply because they happen at the same time. Each point was identified, fixed, and overwhelmed by teams already dominating the space between buildings. The darkness that had once concealed the defenders now isolated them from one another. They could not see their own camp as a whole. The attackers could. At 2:32, the withdrawal clock began to matter more than the entry clock. Dawn was still distant, but the raid had always existed inside a shrinking window. Speed had put the force inside the objective. Discipline would get it back out. Prisoners were moved. Captured material was consolidated. Final checks swept rooms that had already been cleared once, because raids fail when certainty outruns verification. On the shoreline side, the night air carried salt, engine fumes, and the faint electrical smell of overworked equipment. The island was still standing. Its secrets were not. 16 minutes into the raid, the order passed to prepare exfiltration. It did not come as relief. Relief is for later. In the moment, departure is just another phase that can still go wrong. Rear elements tightened, forward elements peeled back in controlled sequence, and the entire structure of the assault reversed itself without losing coherence. This was what made the operation feel impossible to the men caught inside it. The same force that had arrived as an unseen blade was now vanishing before the defenders could fully assemble an answer. At 2:34, the last interior team exited the central block carrying bags heavy with paper and electronics, escorting the detainee into the outer darkness. Behind them, doors swung open, lights buzzed, and the camp looked less like a fortress than a stage after a violent performance, props intact, illusion gone. The defenders who remained alive were left with noise, debris, wounded pride, and the awful knowledge that the most important things had been taken. Not the walls. Not the rooftops. The invisible architecture underneath. Information, access, confidence. 18 minutes into the raid, the sea routes and ground approaches were already reabsorbing the force that had appeared from nowhere. The island shrank behind them into a dark mass with too many unanswered questions inside it. Men in the camp shouted to each other, searched rooms, found empty shelves, cut restraints, checked on the dead and the stunned. They would spend the next hours trying to understand the shape of the attack. They would fail at first because they would think in sequence, first this happened, then that happened, when in truth everything important had happened almost at once. At 2:36, the final count of recovered material began. Encrypted drives linked to coastal movement networks. Document bundles detailing procurement routes and financial channels. Communications logs. Identity rosters. Location sketches for dispersed caches. A concealed stockpile of weapons and munitions with significant operational value, enough to arm future attacks that now would not happen on schedule. The detainee, shaken but alive, represented an even greater asset. A breathing archive whose memory might connect all the rest. What the defenders had trusted was familiar darkness. The walls, the sleeping routines, the dead ground between buildings, the assumption that an island at night feels farther away than it is. But darkness is not owned by the side standing inside it. Darkness belongs to the side prepared to see through it. The men in that camp had believed that silence meant safety. They learned that silence can also mean approach, enclosure, entry, and loss. They had hidden equipment behind concrete, data behind partitions, a prisoner behind misdirection, and themselves behind the oldest confidence in war, that night protects the waiting defender. It did not. The dark stripped away distance, compressed time, and erased warning. By the time the lights came on, the outcome was already moving past them. By the time they understood the raid was already leaving. The island did not fall because the night failed. It fell because the wrong men trusted it. One side feared what it could not see. The other side trained for exactly that condition, moved within it, read it, and used it as cover, compass, and weapon. In 11 violent minutes, control changed hands not because the darkness disappeared, but because one force understood it better than the other. The night belongs to Iran Army Rangers.